Let's start the class with a map. You've never seen this map, perhaps, but it is a map of what? Lower 48. Lots of segments on the map, at least segments east of the Appalachians for the most, or west of the Appalachians. Then you have dates on the map. What might these refer to?
Time of settlement.
That's a really good guess.
Corporation.
Incorporation, kind of a time series. If you go from east to west, you notice something going on here. For the most part, and if I were to use the cursor here so you can see it, you might notice that here in the eastern part of the United States, do you recognize anything there?
Original 13.
Those are the original 13 states or colonies or whatever you want to call them, or if you want to get technical, the original 12 in Vermont. And then you have Kentucky, right? See Kentucky, and then maybe parts of Tennessee in there. And those are blank. And then you have South Louisiana and parts of Texas that are blank. Most of Louisiana. So what are we looking at? What you're looking at is a map, a compiled map of Indian land cessions in the United States. Indian land cessions made, for the most part, after American independence. Formal American independence in 1783. You can see there's an area over here, 1784. And, this is largely something that, a process that takes place beginning in the Old Northwest, following up in the what they used to refer to as the Southwest. And over time, these dates, for the most part, kind of get later and later. And as Andrew said, it largely is associated with non-Indian settlements. So these are land cessions. And the reason there were these land cessions, how about what was going on in this blank space? Were there no land cessions there? Well, of course there were. But those land cessions were between the different colonies, not one federal state. So what we're going to talk about today, and hopefully get into eventually, is what kind of laid out this process. Let's see if we can advance using this thing. Okay, it's going to take me a little time to get my sea legs on this. We'll try. Okay, so here is the reading assignment for this section. It's page 143. 164, The Geographical Dimensions of a New Nation by Kenneth Martis. Martis is an historical political geographer. He's interested in the same things that political scientists are interested in, geographers, and of course historians. This map is not in your textbook, but it's a nice reference map just to begin. And what you're looking at is sort of the areas of strength among loyalists, that is the Tories, during the American Revolution, the areas of greatest, American rebel strength, here referred to as patriots, because I think it came from some high school history website or something like that. So patriots depends on who you're talking about, right? The loyalists or the Tories. Versus those who were ready to reject Britain. And of course, you notice some patterns on this map. And if you've had Geography History 3093, you probably remember this. That for the most part, the urbanized areas along the coast tended to be loyal strongholds, with the exception of what city? Boston, right? And Boston, of course, was the stronghold of the real radicals who were successful at spreading their ideology at the expense of these loyalists. So there's a geography to the American Revolutionary War. And then, of course, the other thing, of course, that you find on here, there are some areas that were so, they weren't necessarily apathetic, but they were sort of on the fence. They didn't know which way to align themselves. New Jersey, it was pinned in between New York and Philadelphia and loyalists, but New Jersey was very rural, and in most of the rural areas, you can see there was fairly strong support for the rebellion. And then there are Native Americans, and this map is quite, idealized because the boundary here, as you can see, the boundary follows what you would probably recognize as the crest of the Appalachians. And if you recall, the crest of the Appalachians was an important boundary established in 1763 by King George III. What was it called? The something line, all right? The Proclamation Line. Yeah, the Proclamation Line, 1763. A real sore spot among American settlers, non-Indian settlers, intended to be a boundary between white land and Indian country, right? Intended to, as you might recall, intended by the British to eliminate or at least reduce antagonisms between Native peoples and the Western settlers, the white settlers in the frontier. And of course, it was largely ignored by white settlers. But during the American Revolution, for the most part, Native peoples near the Proclamation Line declared official neutrality, right? Officially. But you might imagine they were only 20 years or so from having fought the British, aligned mostly with the French, and so the British were the new were the newer powers, less than a generation holding the area, and Native peoples found themselves politically, probably very, very confused, because who's to say who's going to win this war? And it's not to say that all groups were necessarily neutral, right? Not necessarily, but certainly from a diplomacy sense, they tried to be. In geography and political science, we make a big distinction between a couple of ways for organizing space, organizing the geographical space, organizing the state. Okay, and as you probably know, the United States is an experiment in federalism. I just noticed that I had it all plugged up, but no connection, so I'm glad it's not. Maybe that'll stop. Yeah, a work in progress, folks. The political organization of nation states. Now, the United States was nowhere close to being a real nation state in 1790, but it created a system. Some people might say invented, some people might say sort of adapted, or developed a system after following other examples, some maybe the Iroquois. They developed a system that was different from much of the rest of the world, particularly European powers, which were referred to as, for the most part, unitary states. A unitary state has basically one sovereign, right? And that sovereign has, for the most part, ultimate authority over the rest of the country. Federal states, federalism, or federations, as you might call them, have two sovereigns, okay? One for the entire country, and then one for the region. And in the United States, of course, those regional groupings are referred to as states, and so there's a central government and a state government. The Constitution then shares or distributes authority or different levels of authority to those two sovereigns. There are also confederations, and confederations are very loose groupings of individual distinctive states. Early on in the development of the United States Constitution, there was pretty much a debate going on. And you know this, if you've studied the Federalist Papers and the Articles of Confederation period in the United States, for the most part, like the 1780s. Then, under the Articles of Confederation, there were the people who wanted to maintain a similar system, the people who wanted to maintain a loose structure of entities with a very weak central power became known as the Anti-Federalists. With the Federalists, where's it going? Okay, here. The Federalists wanting a central government and the Anti-Federalists wanting more of what we would call a confederation. Today, of course, we have other things that we call supranational organizations like the European Union, like what are some other supranational organizations? NAFTA, okay. United Nations, right? So these are very, very loose, weak structures versus centralized structures. So, the Anti-Federalists essentially missed out on that one. This is a diagram that sort of explains a little bit of this stuff if you're not familiar with it. It has nothing to do with whether or not a country is a democratic state or a totalitarian state, because the Soviet Union, Russia, are both federal states. The United States and Australia and Canada are also federal states. This isn't just a matter of the organization.
In Virginia, I thought it was the other way around. It was the Federalists that advocated for a weak central government, and Anti-Federalists that advocated for a strong central government. Because the concept of federalism is that the power lies with the states, not the central.
Well, I think maybe we're talking about strong federalism versus weak federalism. Maybe?
Perhaps.
Weak federalism meaning a really strong central government. Strong federalism meaning a very weak central government, strong states. But that's really not so important. Keep in mind that we have a federal system that merges. Bluetooth. I'm not a Bluetooth person. Okay. Constitutional conflict and compromise. This is another aspect of this new federal system. Trying to make one state out of many, right, was no easy task. One of the big problems was representation. So you're familiar with this, I'm sure, that large states like New York and Virginia wanted a legislature that was based on population size, right? Because they would have more political power. And small states like Rhode Island and Georgia were very much seeking to have representation by state. Okay? So they would have just as much power. Of course, that was solved with the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise meaning the creation of a two-chamber legislature with the House of Representatives based on population, so-called lower house, and the upper house, the Senate, in which each state would receive two representatives elected at large. So the bicameral legislative model is that particular compromise, although you can make an argument that there's probably a lot less equality in the Senate than in the House when it comes to the different sizes of states. So here's a another map similar to what you've looked at. This is the ratification of the Constitution of 1787. And it gives you a little bit on the dates of these, the dates of the dates when the states passed it or ratified it. And you can see that some of the last ones to come in are big states like New York, Virginia. And anyway, there may not be a really good pattern or clear pattern of, sort of the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist, if you want to go there, or the pattern of affiliation with one or the other. But nevertheless, it became the rule. So here's another problem with representation, for the most part, solved. There was also the issue of these independent colonies that became states having claims to the lands that they essentially inherited with the forfeiture of Great Britain on the continent, at least south of Canada. And each one of these 8 states had what we call Western land claims, claims to the west, as far as the Mississippi River. Some states had gargantuan claims. Virginia and New York were the 2 largest in terms of the size of the claim. These are ranked by the size of the claim. Virginia claimed virtually everything in the West. Thomas Jefferson wrote on, the sort of the geography of Virginia, but he was really writing about the geography of the entire United States. New York claimed a large portion of the West, and the dates that you see here are the dates in which those Western land claims were resolved or relinquished. Mostly these land claims were relinquished to the new federal government, and with that, the federal government would develop something and would have authority over what was referred to as the public domain. So states made deals with Congress and gradually relinquished their Western land claims to the federal government. You can see largely before ratification of the Constitution, but not all of them. And one of the latest example was the state of Georgia, which had claim to the Yazoo country, to the area west of the present-day state of Georgia, all the way to the Mississippi River, and that, of course, includes most of Alabama and Mississippi. And those states would come in later. So it was a fairly large land claim, number 3 in the rank. But you may have heard of something called the Georgia Compact of 1802, and what that was, and that's why we have a star there, the Georgia Compact of 1802 was a deal made between the state of Georgia and the federal government, because in the northern part of Georgia proper, not necessarily only in its western lands, but even within its boundaries, the Cherokee Nation lived in the northwestern part of what was then Georgia. So the federal government agreed to remove Native Americans for that relinquishment of those western lands. So Georgia gave up the land, and the federal government promised sometime in the future, when feasible, Native Americans living within the boundaries of Georgia would be removed. And so here's the new United States right after ratification of the Constitution. And you see the new states, and you see these are the Western land claims, actually. I should have been talking about this map earlier, but here's the area of the Georgia Compact, and the location of the Cherokees, for the most part, right up here, and also included some creeks and other groups within these regions. So have a look at that, the Western Land Claims map. And here is just another map. This is the unfolding of what's going on. So, 1802, the very next year, what president? Jefferson. Yeah, Jefferson, through his agent in France named, is it Robert Livingston, something like that? I'm not sure who was actually on the ground. The negotiation for, initially, all the negotiation was about was access to the Mississippi down here around New Orleans. And then it became, well, a larger chunk of this whole area. And then the deal opened up. And the next thing you know, the United States, Jefferson had purchased all of what France had control of as the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, France had it had recently switched back over to France from Spain. Right? So it's it was a huge land deal. So in 1803, the system that is for the most part worked out here is going to be transferred into the far west of it. All right, so let's talk about the territorial process, the process of creating new states. This is a process that was hammered out in the 1780s, and there are a number of land ordinances that we refer to. There's the Ordinance of 1784, the Land Ordinance of 1785, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance is almost happening at the same time as the ratification of the Constitution. And so it's very much a federal document. Well, as the new states found themselves, independent in this new federal state, the question became, well, as white settlers moved west, as Native Americans get out of the way or lose land through treaty cessions, what do we do with those new lands? And the answer was you create new states. And most of this was very experimental, very theoretical. And the early prototype area to hammer out this process was the present-day state of Ohio. And for the most part, the states that became states in what was called the Northwest Territory, the territory northwest of the Ohio River. Now, if we look at this we've got the 13 original colonies. They didn't undergo a territorial process like this. And then there was Vermont. It was an independent republic. Texas was annexed, of course, in 1845, having been a province of Mexico, New Spain, and then Mexico, and then overrun by American settlers from the southern states. An independent republic from 1836. An independent republic from 1836 to 1845, and then annexed by the United States in 1845. So it did not undergo the territorial process, and for the most part, California didn't either. It was even a quicker process, but it didn't really undergo the long territorial process. West Virginia, of course, didn't because it was broken up from the larger state of Virginia during the Civil War. And then there are probably other examples, but I always throw in this one, Oklahoma, at least part of Oklahoma, did not undergo a territorial development. Which part? Which half? Well, southeast or west? The eastern part of Oklahoma, or the eastern southern part of Oklahoma, which was known as Indian Territory, okay, or the Indian Territory. Indian Territory was never a territory. It was never an organized territory at all, even though it kind of got that nice, convenient name as a territory. Now, there was an Oklahoma territory. It was settled under a territorial procedure following the Northwest Ordinance. But an Oklahoma territory was established in 1890, right? And was a territory from 1890 all the way up to 1907 with statehood. And at statehood, the mostly Democratic oriented or Democratic Party oriented Indian Territory was joined together with the Republican settled Oklahoma Territory. And the new territory itself became less democratic, but still democratic, okay, in terms of party affiliation. So in 1907, the powers that be, the Republicans, didn't want a new state to come in that was strongly democratic and heavily populated as Indian Territory was. But again, Indian Territory never underwent an actual territorial process. There was never a form of organization we would call territorial procedure. Question? Okay. So that makes it interesting, right? Makes it really interesting. It's kind of an anomaly. And of course, you probably know why, hopefully. There was no territorial organization. The Indian nations that inhabited it didn't want territorial organization for the most part. They tried in 1905 with the state of Sequoia, right? But that was ignored by Congress. They said, no way, because you're Democrats. The Public Land Survey of the United States was developed in the 1780s, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. Perhaps you already are familiar with it, but it was largely the origin, the idea largely came from Thomas Jefferson. And his plan for organizing and measuring public domain lands had a number of purposes. And number one was a disposal of the public domain, because you know, what's one of those terms, what's a term that we always hear when we talk about Jefferson and land, or Jefferson and farmers? Remember Jefferson's idea of the yeomanry, yeoman farmer, the hard-working farm families that would inhabit the frontier and would, they were the ideal, the democratic ideal of Jefferson. Why? Well, I don't have my poker chips with me, so there's no reason for you to answer that. I think you might say, right, one answer would be because he believed that democracy would be safeguarded by a state, a country made up of farmers. A country made up of farmers would protect democracy. They would not be and not just farmers, but farmers who owned their land. Land ownership was key. The idea that land was property and property was a way to wealth. Right? So that idea of real estate and property and getting real estate into the hands of the common man, the hands of farmers, was a key to safeguarding democracy in Jefferson's idea. Opinion. Okay. And of course, Thomas Jefferson had some beautiful writing and Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, right? Except for the obvious fact he was a slave owner. So, he was the ultimate when it comes to cognitive dissonance, right? So he's a fascinating character, fascinating founder. So here's one of those cognitive dissonance aspects of the United States Public Land Survey, or as it's sometimes referred to as the Public Land Survey System, PLSS. The Public Land Survey System is a way of describing land, describing the legal description of a parcel of land in a completely abstract sense, without any reference to the actual location, the actual makeup of the land, landmarks. So it created a uniform grid that disregarded the presence of terrain, disregarded rivers and water bodies, and it entrenched the system of what we refer to as isolated farm settlement. The isolated single-family unit farmstead became the norm through Jefferson's plan. And with that, I think I'm losing juice on this, so we'll move up to this. Okay, so here you have some outlines of land survey. These are actual examples of survey lines on the left. In the middle, cadastral lines are actual property boundaries, and this is, you can see the one on top here is from, they're both counties in Ohio. Okay? But look at the rectilinear form of those land holdings. And then if you go over to the right side, these are actually things like fields and woodlots and boundaries around 1955. Still rectilinear. Land in the United States, wherever the public land survey is initiated, follows, for the most part, this pattern. In the original 13 colonies, you have this system of, the older system of meets and bounds, in which property lines were established using landmarks like trees and boulders and rivers. In fact, it still exists like this, although it's a little easier with GPS these days. So those boundaries were initially set using landmarks. And if you look a little closer, we've got the survey, we've got actual land holdings, or what we call a cadastral map of properties. And then we have things like fields. And you see that the system doesn't have that rigid rectilinearity. It has, actually, it may look very chaotic, but you can probably tell me initially, you probably can't tell me anything about land value looking at this map, but you can probably tell me a little bit about land value looking at that map, can't you? Let's say land value. Let's say land use, maybe. What type of land uses would you probably suspect here, where these parcels are larger?
Agriculture.
What types of land parcels here or activities here are land parcels? More than likely, I would think, you probably find things like cultivated land here and probably things like pasture land there. But it could be right. So land quality tends to be more logical within the meets and bounds system. But the problem is surveying. And that's what, one of Jefferson's big intentions of the public land survey system was not only to get land in the hands of the yeomanry, but to do it very quickly and very efficiently, and to avoid this big legal problem that had bogged down the courts for throughout the colonial period, the litigation associated with property boundaries. Litigation, that is, court battles, people suing one another over property boundaries, because property boundaries are so amorphous and so difficult to determine because of, well, survey lines were pretty accurate, but then the problem was those records would get lost and courthouses would burn, and then people would dispute land holdings. So the public land survey system was a way to make the whole geography of the West an abstract notion that could be where you could transfer property without even visiting it. Okay, I'm going to buy 160 acres from the United States Land Office, and that 160 acres is located here. I just got to go find it.
That's why the western states are like Oxy.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. The boundaries were run along lines of longitude and latitude, Colorado, Wyoming. And of course, the western lands were not settled as early by farmers in many areas. Now, they may have been along rivers. And since they were open fairly late, it was often the case that, I saw me coming that time, I guess. It was often the case that you have cattlemen and ranchers claiming land. and much larger land parcels. And of course, in the Mountain West and the arid West, the federal government is still the largest landowner. Okay, and in Nevada, it's like something like 90% of the entire state owned by the federal government to do it. It's not to say it's not used, but it is not. So, good question. You got a partnership. The system of settlement then is sort of abstracted. It's made easier to get land into the hands of individuals. It would, of course, avoid the bogged down courts, and it would be a lot easier on the courts. So the reduced litigation over property boundaries. And it simplified land transactions by making the description of land very quick and very easy, based on quarters. Okay, we'll look at an example in a little bit. Other reasons. Now, when the public domain was created with those Western land cessions coming together, being owned by the federal government, the federal government's really good about spending your money, right? The federal government had big plans. It was going to operate on the sale of Western lands. The problem was, not so many people bothered to do the technical thing of purchasing the lands, right? There was something referred to as squatters' rights, right? Or preemptive landholding. It's a very common practice. In other words, settlers would go into the public domain and live there and clear land and establish farms, and maybe sometime in the future bother to claim it legally. Okay, so that was one of the problems. The federal government was never able to really utilize income from land sales to operate, and even the federal government at this time was minuscule. What you would see over time throughout the 19th century, throughout the 1800s, was a continual attempt to sort of legitimate land holding. And of course that led to, and during the Civil War, the Homestead Act, where the government finally just gave up. Finally gave up by trying to sell land at $1.25 an acre, and just handed it over to settlers who wanted to claim. So they could claim 160 acres. After 5 years of living on it and improving up on it, you could claim that land, and we'll talk about that later. But so this model, and it sounded really nice. The plan sounded really good. Executing the plan, all sorts of problems there. And another one that's just kind of a side note is originally Jefferson wanted a system that would be a metric system. He wanted townships, big chunks of land, 10 miles by 10 miles. And those were actually 10 geographic miles by 10 geographic miles. And we don't even know what a geographic mile is, but it's different than a statute mile. The statute mile is one of the old imperial measures. And if we look at what we have, then here is something you're probably familiar with. We have a sort of a diagram showing a large region, and each one of these squares would be referred to as a township. Right? The townships are described cartographically on a map by their relative distance from what's called the principal meridian, that is, the line of longitude, but it's actually not a line of longitude in many cases. North-south line divides the division between east and west. So if you're located east of that principal meridian, your township is described as something east. Okay, and then we have a baseline, kind of like the equator, I guess, in division north and south. So each of these townships would be described as so many townships. It's townships, right? North, south. Right? Okay, here we go. Example. example statement. Okay, so we've got Township 2 South. That's 2 measures south of the baseline. So the Township 2 South, range 3 west, west of the principal meridian. So we've got this one, excuse me. So 3 west, 2 south. I always say township first. So Township 2 South, range 3 west. Then, if we take that individual square, it's 6 by 6. These are 6 statute miles by 6 statute miles. And you'll notice how they're numbered. There's actually a funny name for this that I can never remember, but it's the numbering system of the sections is zigzag. And it's zigzag for a reason, so that when you're looking at a whole bunch of them, you're able to identify where the township is. So if we take section 14 here, then we can describe that 640 acre square mile as section 14 of Township 2 South, range 3 west. But it gets better, right? Because then we can take, and here's another, this is an actual example from a township somewhere in the United States. 6 miles or 480 chains by another 480 chains. Here's the example from Illinois. Illinois, received a number of different surveys. So each one of them still fit within the public land survey system, but we've got a number of different sections of townships. You don't even know that. I just thought it was kind of pretty colorful map. And here we got the isolated farmstead that winds up being associated with that system, because within the United States, the general size of the farms prior to 1870 something were, as a standard measurement, about 160 acres, or 1/4 of a section. Okay? Quarter section, 160 acres, 1/4 of 640 acres. And over time, farms, most farms in even 1863 were not, in 1862, 160 acres was too big for a lot of them, so they subdivided. Of course, now, the average size of a farm in the United States far larger than that. Okay? Here's an actual cadastral map of, you can see 9 or 10 sections. This is within Oklahoma. And you can see even, I think it's Oklahoma. And you can see the numbers indicating the acreage of each parcel with the name of, and you probably, how many have seen these in courthouses? Probably gone to the county courthouse. There's always big cadastral map, what they refer to as the county plat or something like that. Here's a map of the various public land survey systems within the United States. So in most of Oklahoma, we base our township numbering system on the Oklahoma baseline and the meridian, the principal meridian, which has a name. What's it called? The Indian Meridian, which is just west of here between Stillwater and I-35. Runs right through there. But you notice it's not exactly a line of longitude, because it's not exactly the same line. It might be. I guess that's probably a correction line. So yeah, probably the same line. But if we go out to the panhandle of Oklahoma, the panhandle of Oklahoma townships are numbered with the 103rd meridian right here, which is referred to as the Cimarron meridian. Okay, and so the Cimarron meridian only has townships enumerated east of the Cimarron meridian. So kind of interesting that way. Okay, so I think we have a little bit of time to get into this. So, also in 1787, in addition to the Constitution, you have this important document, very important document when it comes to United States Indian affairs, the Northwest Ordinance. And in the Northwest Ordinance, as well as parts of the Constitution makes it fairly clear that the United States federal government and not the states have authority in dealing with the Indian tribes, because the Indian tribes were, in 1787, recognized as sovereign entities. And that's because they were relatively powerful and held land that the United States desired. So they were dealt with on a sovereign to sovereign basis, usually. And there were a lot of legal precedents for what was created in the Northwest Ordinance. For the most part, the United States intended to follow a pattern established by the British, in which whenever land was sought from Indian tribes, there would be a treaty between those two sovereigns, describing the land that was to be ceded by the Indian tribe to the colony, or in this case, to the United States. So the federal government establishes is established in the Constitution, in 3 different sections of the Constitution, plus the Northwest Ordinance as having ultimate sovereignty over Indian tribes, but it does recognize it as individual sovereigns. And that any settlement, legitimate settlement, would have to be preceded by legal land cessions through treaties, through sovereign treaties. Initially, the executive branch was overseeing Indian affairs, but ultimately Congress, the United States Congress, would have what's referred to as plenary authority, ultimate authority over Indian affairs. In the case of, if you look at, and some of you have actually been in the Indian country class, and you've actually seen the wording in the Northwest Ordinance. It actually follows from the Treaty of Greenfield in 1795 or 1785, right? And but the wording says something like this: Congress will deal fairly with the Indian tribes, and there are 2 ways of taking land: peaceful through treaty, or, if need be, by conquest. Right? So it gives Congress gives the United States, gives itself authority to conquer Indian tribes if necessary. Okay, it's kind of a side note, but it's there. So we wind up with that. We wind up with a map of Indian land cessions. Some are large, some are not. The color coding is indicative of the sort of chronology, and each one of these, are representing at least one treaty. There were over 700 treaties developed between the United States and Indian tribes. Around 400 and some actually ratified by Congress. Okay, not all of them were ratified. But those Indian treaties often included cessions. Right? And here are some of these are, for the most part, the cessions. It's not a completely comprehensive map, but it might get you thinking a little bit. By the way, if you look at Oklahoma, you're looking at 1818, and it's 1825. And the cession here, you might guess, what tribe what tribes are ceding this land? Right here. These are the Osage land cessions. So a lot of land cessions led to the relocation, okay, of Indian tribes in the West. So these are just the initial land cessions. And of course, we'll talk more about what's going on, but later on. But when you have the establishment of new states, in which there are states that were intending to expand slavery to the West, and states that were free soil states, you have a contest going on. So you're probably familiar with the statehood 2-by-2 procedure. Southern states advanced to the West, New states were created in the South. Whenever there was a new state created in the South, there was another state created in the North. So until about 1824, it was a dead heat. Western settlement, new states, power in Congress pretty much stayed equal or at parity. And you're going to read in Carville Earl's section, Carville Earl's chapter, about this regional sort of political football of slavery and Indian affairs to a degree that began to take place during the Jacksonian era. And of course, you know, with the emergence of the Jacksonian Democrats, we have a much more populist set of policies, particularly when it comes to Indian affairs. So here's the map of statehood up until 1828, and then, you know, after this, if you look at Carville Earl's chapter, you'll read about Illinois and the significance of Illinois, the significance of Missouri and Kansas, and sort of the finality or the decision making about slavery. So it has a lot to do with agriculture, has a lot to do with regional culture.